Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to Talking Up Africa. It's your live business show on African current affairs, and it's brought to you by our team at Africa Scotland Business Network. We are based in South Africa, and ASBN is a pan-African business network of leading companies and organisations that's bridged with Scotland and increasingly bridged with the wider EMEA regions. For those who don't know who I am, my name's Claire Alexander, and I'm one of the 3 directors here at Africa Scotland Business Network. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you into this live event, into Talking Up Africa. This episode is all about the African elections. What a mammoth year it is in terms of politics, the private sector, investments, in business in Africa, with 23 elections taking place in 2024. What does all this mean for Africa's burgeoning and emerging economies? Well, we're about to find out right now, thanks to an exceptional multidisciplinary panel of experts tuning in from London, Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Ghana. So please say hello to each other in the chat. For those who are in the audience, please stay connected with us and to our esteemed panelists. I'm now going to hand over to our fantastic moderator, Gordon Mackay. He's a senior lead at ACPO Worldwide. He's tuning in from London today. He's a board advisor to ASBN, member company here at ASBN. And Gordon is in fact a former South African politician himself. So we couldn't have asked for a better moderator for Talking Up Africa, the Africa elections episode. So Gordon, I'm not going to take up any more time. This is going to be the most intriguing, fascinating conversation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome to everyone joining us for this very exciting elections edition of this episode. We've been chatting about it for a while internally, and we've wanted to wait to get to the latter part of the year to have this conversation, because as Claire mentioned, 23 elections happening across Africa this year, most of which are happening in Q4. Globally, it's all part of a global election super event where pretty much 75% of the world have gone on to re-elect their leaders this year. And as you can notice from a very high level, there's been a very anti-incumbent message, whether that is kind of kicking out, Mr. Biden in the United States and re-electing Donald Trump, or even more broadly across the globe. We saw in South Africa, for example, the first time that the majority party was taken to only 40% and having to form a new government of national unity. We've seen significant changes in government in Senegal. We've just seen the previous president lose his role in the first quarter of the year, and literally the new president's sort of just taking full control of parliament in the parliamentary elections that have just gone past. I think we were all astounded by the change of government in Botswana, where no political pundits were anticipating such a dramatic change. And as I'm very pleased we have Angelique with us today, who is monitoring the Namibian results as they sort of tick in. And are we going to expect a big and anticipated change in Namibia as well? Angelique has said to me before the call she doesn't anticipate that, but she also has noted that voter turnout is through the roof, and voter turnout obviously really, I've always experienced in my political career, has always led to unpredictable results. When people turn out and share their votes, things can change. Today's conversation is really going to be, as you know, we have a fantastic panel ahead of us. I'd just like to also make sure everyone is aware that Taylor Parker is stepping in today for Tara O'Connor, and Dr. Kobe, I think, will probably join us through the call at some point. He's just being held up on some prior commitments. But we've got more than enough to chat to today. We're going to start at the highest level. I'm going to ask the panelists each to kind of tell us what they've seen on the ground in terms of there's been 23 elections happening across the continent. What regional patterns and trends are emerging that business should be paying close attention to at this vantage point as we come to the end of the year, the end of this election cycle? To my panelists, what do you see as the major sort of patterns emerging, whether that be Africa-wide or regional or even in a country-specific context that will have implications for business in the next sort of 12 to 24 months? Angelique, you're closest to me on the screen. Do you mind if I have you kick off?
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks, Gordon. I think in Namibia we're seeing something similar to what we've seen, you know, in some of the other African jurisdictions. But the reality is that our, call it liberation struggle, is now 34 years ago, and the youth are, first of all, a much bigger part of our population than they were in the last 5 to 10 years, and also they are getting a lot more demanding on what they are getting from government, right? So they are no longer as emotionally connected to the liberation struggle. While they respect what happened 34 years ago and that we became independent, they are saying we need to hold the government accountable. We want to see transparency. We want to see education, healthcare, these kind of things, and certainly employment. So in some of the stats I'll show you later, you'll see that while our graduates have increased or doubled in the last 4 to 5 years, the employment in that space, in that age group, has not. So they're saying we want more from you, government. And PS, we've got a budding oil and gas industry here. That means we don't want to see corruption. We want to see more transparency, etc. So they are putting their vote, and they very much did yesterday put their vote to the field. So let's see what happens. We don't expect a full-on change, but it could be. The youth vote might be stronger. I think what happened in Botswana with the ruling party there being completely wiped off the table did two things. It made the people nervous on the ground here, so the ruling party and all of their supporters, but it also showed that that kind of thing can happen without major violence, which is a really good sign. So from my feet on the ground, those are sort of the observations I have.
Angelique, that's a great point to depart. Maybe Taylor, I mean, I know you work in political risk consulting, and I would really like to get your view on the trends, but also the kind of political uncertainty that the youth vote is introducing into the electorate. Is that something we all need to be aware of and watching?
100%. I think to touch briefly on the trends, 100%, as Angelique said, you are having far younger populations coming in that don't have that attachment to liberation movements, and these really, really high levels of youth unemployment. And that's, been the trend across Southern Africa, as we said, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana. And just to throw some quick stats, I think it was about 70% of Botswana and Namibia's populations are below the age of 35, and in South Africa, it's roughly a third. So, and across the continent, that is also the case. And as you say, it's bringing in winds of change. And if, Botswana is a politically stable country. As we said, there was a peaceful democratic transition of power. But there is a little bit of, naturally uncertainty around who the new president is, what his policies will be, following up on campaign promises, and where that focus will lie. And I think that will be, something that, and I know that we guide clients through it, and we have been this year, is understanding when there is such a drastic change in power, how does that impact, their operations, and just coming to grips with, who the new government is. But generally, I think even as we saw in South Africa, it's, for us, it's created a renewed sense of optimism, and there's been a lot of investment, drive, and a lot of positive sentiment coming out of the election. So it's, it's not necessarily to say that the uncertainty is a bad thing. It's just about navigating it initially.
Thank you. I think that's a really helpful point. Charles, bringing in the legal perspective, obviously big changes in governance can result in big changes in regulation and legislation. From your perspective in Tanzania, is this something that you guys are seeing on the ground? Are we seeing governments begin to shift their focus in terms of their policy and legislative and regulatory mandates, or is it still something to come?
Yeah, so in Tanzania, what we have seen, because to just go back, just take a step back, we had one of the most complicated sort of elections back in 2019, 2020. This is the presidential elections that resulted into 99% win to the incumbent, which was actually by and large facilitated by the state structures, the legal framework then, which I think the key one was that, for example, now the Electoral Commission, which has the responsibility to oversee the elections, was ideally appointed by the president. There were quite a number of sort of I'll say immunities that were imposed on the various electoral officers who were overseeing the elections, and then there was also the sort of position in law where you actually cannot go to court to challenge the presidential elections. Now, since 2019, 2020, to that, the opposition were really trying to push for reforms in law. In January this year, there was some proposed amendments to our election laws, and there was introduced a concept of an independent electoral commission. Whilst that in itself expresses, even in the print of the law, that it will act independently, you still have the chairman being appointed by the sitting president, which in all fairness, we've seen a lot of the opposition trying to push against it, because it was in their agenda in 2020 when they were essentially pushing for reforms. And just on that point, to highlight that the proposed changes in themselves did not, at least by observation, create any significant changes in the legal framework, because we still have the same results where we effectively do not have an independent electoral commission. And I think that can be attested to the recent local government elections that we had on Wednesday this week. The results are just out, and what we hear or what we see is that, again, the incumbent has won by almost 99%, which the opposition is really raising issues and concerns about.
Charles, thank you. I think that raises a really incredible, important issue just for people to be aware of. The Economics Intelligence Unit only describes Africa as having 5 what we would call full, although slightly flawed democracies, and those all are based in SADC and include obviously Ghana. Most of Africa's other democracies are seen as sort of hybrid systems where they combine elements of democracy with elements of authoritarian rule, which is something that we would see, for example, in maybe Tanzania or even in Senegal. My question, therefore, also, and maybe Angelique and Charles, this one's directed towards you, but to help people understand on a general level, how is it that businesses actually engage governments in the region on issues around regulation and policy when, for example, most of these countries don't have, for example, a very formalized lobbying sector? I work for a sort of a public affairs firm, and we have very structured interventions in which we can work with government, because those are clearly created as part of the institutional mechanism to engage with government to kind of give feedback on policy and regulation. Having been a South African parliamentarian, I'm aware that that process is not as established. So that's the first part of how do businesses engage. The second question is also, in many cases, the manifesto that political parties put together before an election has no real impact on the public policy platform that is then adopted in government, right? So again, my question, I think, for Charles, who I know has a deep interest in kind of what is the reform mechanisms that are required to make sure that governments are reforming and becoming more transparent and accountable. But just to explain to those who are listening to this and some of our smaller members who need to engage with business, how do we actually go about engaging with government in these contexts? Angelique, do you have some insights you can share?
Yeah, so look, I have to be honest with you. I suppose it also depends on the size of the country and the age of the business environment, if you want, in respect to the age of the government, right? And in our case, the government is only young. It's only 34 years old as such. The business environment is much older. And so it was from the start an adoption of nearly, I want to say, a public-private partnership to a degree, where business was formally and informally pulled into government, into specific government pockets, if you will, to provide advice and guidance on some of the matters. So you'll always have this mix of, government will in any case do what they're going to do, but they in Namibia certainly do take private guidance. If I don't want to say advice because that's too strong, but take private guidance. And we, as the big international banks, operating locally, we have to have very close relationships with government, with all layers of government, different ministries, finance, obviously the governor, regulator, etc. And we try and represent what our client base and our stakeholder base is telling us as well. And we're very often able to do that. And so quite a few businesses, even in the public sector, play a role in trying to give advice and what they see on the ground to government. Like I said, to start off with, it doesn't always all get taken into account. Sometimes the government will come with an interesting idea and put it in motion, and everyone goes, whoa, okay, wait, we have to rethink this. So they do go to platforms where they seek advice from the public. The tricky part in Namibia is we're a small population over a massive area. So to get public buy-in, you really have to travel the country and go to regions. And what they're doing now with the local content policy that they're working on, they have to go to all of the regions to try and socialize it. It's not easy to achieve, but they do try to take the private and the regional things into account before they make policies.
That's helpful. Thank you. Chris, do you have a similar experience, or do you have a view on how businesses are engaging or can engage with government in an effective way?
Yeah, no. So I think from a Tanzanian perspective, what we've essentially seen, I think it's more or less the same to what Angelica sees in Namibia. But I think the starting point is usually just the sort of political readiness to actually have those particular engagements, and this actually does tie into the broader sort of government priorities. So, for example, when the current president was sworn in 2021, her focus was on a number of projects in Tanzania, and one key project that she made a commitment to see through is the massive 30 billion LNG project, which I think with time we have seen that there's been sort of a declining political sort of will to actually see this project through within the timelines that the government did actually commit. And we understand the relevant stakeholders for this project have been actively engaging the government to actually push through the project, but the progress has been significantly slow. I think purely because the priorities may have shifted, or the government does not see this as a priority project in the short term. There has been, or there are quite a number of, I would say, there are quite a number of channels within which one can engage and influence policy amendments in law, but then this can be at the sort of the ministerial level. And also it can be as part of the process that the government puts in place when it wants to change the laws, because there is actually mandatory stakeholder engagement process. It is always the case that this is done, but what is taken on board is actually ultimately at their discretion. So there are certain sort of recommendations that can be adopted, and there's some that can be left out. It is ultimately up to what the government sees as being a priority for them at that point in time.
Thank you, Charles. Talia, I suppose when we're talking about risk, a lot of policy uncertainty and regulatory uncertainty obviously creates a lot of risk. And as both Angelique and Charles have pointed out, the process for engagement of government exists, but it's not always particularly easy to engage through. And a lot of small businesses or businesses in general have a challenge in doing that. So with the work that you do, how do you help your clients sort of identify key risk, and how do you go about supporting them in managing it?
Well, completely, I think the first thing is dependent on sector, extractives versus banking versus infrastructure. Your sectors, it's very different. And from there, you have to identify your key stakeholders and influencers in government. And, you know, those are the people that I think, as Angelique said, especially if you're a bigger firm, that, you know, you can potentially try to engage with. I think if you're a smaller business, you know, joining an organization, you know, that potentially lobbies with governments is always a good idea. I think, you know, whether that's a sector-wide organization or, you know, a mining organization or whatever it is that that might, you know, be able to put forward those recommendations. But yeah, like I say, I think it's very much, you know, dependent on sector, and then, you know, depending on the size of the company, and then, as I say, moving forward in identifying who's who, you know, and there's always many levels to that as well. I know, for example, in Tanzania, you know, you've got your mining commission, you've got your minerals ministry. There are, you know, sometimes several avenues for you to kind of look at an approach and see where you find your success. I think, as Charles and Angelique says, you know, it's ultimately about, you know, the government will always want to do what is best for them and what they believe is, you know, the best. But as long as you can try and engage in those conversations with the right people, you know, you could potentially have more opportunity to push through, as you say, policy change or anything like that.
So Tilly, before I go on to some of the more specifics of some of the sectoral questions, I did just want to ask you, in terms of a general picture of risk that you've seen coming out of these elections, what direction is risk? Up, down, neutral? I mean, I know it's a hard question for the bulk of Africa, but maybe break it down to a region. Do these big changes in government that we've seen, particularly in the SADC region, particularly even in West Africa, does that mean higher, lower risk? And what does that mean when we're talking about risk profiles? And what does that mean for investment? Obviously, is the subsequent question.
I think it's very region specific. It's obviously very country specific, but to try broad stroke it, I do think it's very region specific. I think in Southern Africa, you know, as we said, we had peaceful transitions, and, you know, while the, you know, former ruling parties may have lost power or lost their majorities, there is still, you know, positive sentiment that has come out of those elections. And I think across kind of SADC, that's more of the, you know, that's more of a lower risk, if you will. You know, even somewhere like Mozambique at the moment, there's a lot of post-election unrest, but I think, you know, once that has kind of subsided, looking into next year, it might be a little bit more of a lower risk. West Africa, I think, is it's very difficult to you know, give a general picture, but I do think there is a little bit more of a medium risk. I think if you look at a country like Senegal, for example, you know, you've had a you know, as I said, or Africa's youngest elected leader put into power. Before this, you know, he'd never really served in politics. He campaigned. It was quite a firebrand campaign of, we're going to reassess oil and gas contracts, reassess mining contracts, you know, really Pan-African sovereignty. And that to investors is a little bit of obviously it places pressure, and it's a little bit of a shock. And you know, especially Senegal's also got a budding oil and gas sector, and they've started producing. And that's, you know, can create that uncertainty. So I think in West Africa, you know, it is a little bit more of a medium to higher risk of seeing how these things kind of go forward. But it's only been a few months.
Thanks, Talia. And coming back to, obviously, oil and gas is important across the continent, and increasingly so as we make new discoveries of oil fields. I know, for example, that economic policies around extractors are really, really important. I know that you had a few stats that you wanted to take us through potentially, and a short presentation would now be a good opportunity to share some of that with the group.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Yeah, happy to go through them. It's not so much stats on really the oil and gas policy type of things, but on what we think the influences on the election will be, and also then what that might well mean for the oil and gas industry. So happy to take you through it. If someone shares. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so if we could just go to the next slide. I think, as I said earlier, some of the interesting. It's not showing but I'll speak to them. Some of the main parts here are very much the election outcome and the party dynamic. So we expect the ruling party, we as in RMB, but suppose the main audience in Namibia are expecting the ruling party to still hold on to their lead, even though we understand that the youth vote is becoming a lot more prevalent and also might change that. The ruling party, for the first time since we became independent, lost their majority in 2019, and we expect the margin to reduce this year. It is at the moment looking like that, but we're far from the final votes being counted. I think the voter behavior is uncertain. So about 40% of people switched parties in 2019, and then the youth vote this year is expected to definitely have a lot more gravitas than it has had in the past, and also we have far more youth voting. Then the problem or the challenge is, if you want to put a real challenge to the ruling party, you need to really make sure that there's fragmented opposition, and we still do have that. We have one very strong party that is, as expected, sitting in a strong second place, but then rather than all of the other 6 or 7 or 8 parties putting momentum into the second place one, they are sort of fragmenting the opposition, which then means there's lack of cohesion when it comes to the efficiencies. And then, so this influence on public discourse can lead to heightened scrutiny on corruption. That is a very big topic here. I mean, I sit in some of the global conversations, and we are told that Namibia really doesn't have bad corruption if you compare it to much of the rest of Africa. But for Namibia, we still don't like the corruption that is there, and I think the youth and the voters are calling out on that. And then the regional mind shift around the ruling parties in Botswana and even in South Africa has caused a little bit of unsettled, moods here, as I said right at the stop. And then the governance, transparency, and those topics are really important to the public here at the moment. Then if you go to the next slide, that really just summarizes the main issues. Oh, sorry, I don't know why this, maybe that's why I sent you the other one, but it doesn't matter. So corruption, education, and healthcare are definitely the main things that people want to see a change in, and I'll go into a bit more detail on it. Then improved governance, but also less delays in governance. So especially in this new sector that we are hoping to be able to be part of, we are too slow as a country. Things are too slow. Changes are happening too slowly. Ports are being built too slowly. So it's really about getting a move on with the things that we say we're going to do. Less talk, more walk. And then, there is talk about increased taxes and royalties, etc. We need to be careful as a country there. We need to be careful not to scare the investors away, but to make sure that the country still gets the correct benefit from this industry if and when it goes ahead in the future. So really if you go to the next slide, some of the main topics that we are looking at is we have a different voting balance with far more youth voting this time. Unemployment, and I'll take you to another slide there just now, is estimated to be over 40%. There is perception of corruption. The oil and gas companies already in Namibia are under pressure to create jobs, but they also first need to understand the policy environment that they're operating within, because otherwise there is no proper way of doing it. The market anticipates an increase in unemployment. This industry might change things, but it's going to take time. We can't have changes in 5 minutes. It will take 5 to 10 years for that really to change if we give it the right amount of time that it requires. We feel that government efficiencies are low. Local content will decide what the new future looks like, but we have to, as I said, be careful to balance it well and not do things that will actually scare investors off. We need to have improved fiscal support, and we're afraid that the statistics, especially on unemployment, etc., that are out are old and not being updated, and that causes trust issues, especially in the youth. On the next page, you'll see a few graphs. I hope they are showing, so that's good. So I'm not too much going to focus on the male versus female population. The bottom left one is what's really important to understand, and why you have the youth going, okay, wait a minute, what's going on here? So between the last election and even from 10 years ago and now, we have got a vast increase in graduates, right? Yes, in the secondary space, but even more so in the tertiary space. But if you look to the right of that, you're not seeing an increase in those people getting jobs. There's not the amount of people that are educated is not translating into jobs. And that's really where the guys are very frustrated and saying, we need to do something different because we're getting the education. And, take it this way, there's still not enough people being educated. But even those that are sitting around for 5 years without a job. And then the top part really just shows you that high middle bar, which is showing the youth. I have to say, over the past 2 to 3 years, where this potential oil and gas industry has come across, the youth have phenomenally impressed me. They are creating summits and forums and all sorts of things. And it's really amazing to see. So they are not just sitting and complaining, but they're really coming to the party. And I have conversations with some of them at the conferences, and I think, wow, you guys are like 10 times more clever than I am. So they're doing a great job. The next page really then speaks to this discord between the statistics that we see and the statistics agency sees and even the World Bank sees. So the World Bank came up with some number of 20% unemployment here. Goodness only knows where they got that from. The UN estimates it to be around the nearly 50% mark. And we believe that that is probably correct. The opportunity absolutely sits right in front of us to change it now with we're sitting on all sorts of industries, but for now, the most exciting and by far the biggest is naturally the oil and gas industry. So the opportunity to get this right in time is massive, but then we need to get some of the policy and some of the reforms, etc., right as a country. Otherwise, we scare off investors. So really on the next slide, which is nearly the end, is impacts on the oil and gas sector are shifts. Political policy needs to be continuous. Policy needs to be clear. We're not there yet. There was a major baseline study done here by one of the main auditors, together with two of the big operators, to see how ready Namibia can be, and then that will have to inform how you create local content policy, and that it has to be a phased approach, etc. Political stability naturally makes a big difference. So yes, as a country, there is perhaps a want for change, but we also have to understand that if we keep the existing government in place, even if with a much reduced majority, perhaps that causes a little bit of more accountability to, okay, we can now do the right things to be in power again in 4 years' time. So that's always a good thing. Then we need to focus on sustainability and diversification of the benefits. They can't sit simply at government level and sit there and not be used well. This is why, for example, the Namibian government is going and trying to model things like a sovereign wealth fund on countries like Norway, which we know are the poster child, right, when it comes to oil and gas. So it's really about making sure the benefit ultimately trickles down to the people. But for this, we need to get our policies, etc., right. I've spoken to the beneficiation policies, etc. The mining industry, remember, has been a massive industry in Namibia for many years, and this has been able to guide quite a lot of the policy creation. The trick is oil and gas is bigger and much beastlier, so it's dangerous then to, as a country, suddenly get exposed to so much potential revenue and get the policies around it right. So that's really important. The investment climate is critical. I mean, we have a very stable government, and we hope that it stays that way after this election. We have a great infrastructure, etc., in the country. So it's really important that we keep that investment climate as good as it is, and even try and improve it. Just we need to create stability and transparency in all of these policies. And then, the rest speaks to social stability and urban population growth needs to be managed properly. Like I said earlier, we are vastly spread across a huge country with a small population. And so to get just the information about all of this and how to become a part of it and how you can train yourself or upskill yourself to become a part of it, it's a very difficult mission to try and get that information through to the whole country. But the government is trying, the private sector is trying, and hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll see some real difference. And then if you go to the last slide, I think it really summarizes where we are. We are preparing for an evolving landscape, no matter what the result of this election. I mean, if the slightly more unexpected happens and we end up with a different party and hence a different party president, then I think we're going to see a little bit of okay, now what? How do we do this? If the current ruling party stays in power, but with a much reduced majority, then you'll have a very different mix in your parliament, and that could become quite interesting. There are demographic shifts, as I've said. The youth is becoming more part of the population and a much louder vote. And if we look at continuity in government, I mean, the newspaper headline today was change or continuity, and it was very interesting with the article. But I think continuity may offer short-term stability, but the youth expectations will drive either a real accountability on the government now, or probably a definitive change in the next election. So there's a call to action. The oil and gas companies do have to align with national priorities. They have to demonstrate tangible value, and they have to help us address unemployment while we have to address the living standards in Namibia. But they can only do this in an environment that is transparent and makes sense and makes their investment good for them as well as the country. So interesting times, I think, for us in Namibia. And yeah, I hope that they have a bit of an overview.
Thank you very much. I think, a very helpful presentation. And I think what you've done is crystallized, I think, some of the core issues, especially around the idea of how that sort of electoral accountability that we're starting to see in African electorates in South Africa and Botswana. Corruption was a key issue, as was it is in Senegal. This idea of economic growth is always a perennial issue. South Africa and African countries suffer from high levels of unemployment. And we know that, in terms particularly where populations are young, unemployment's even higher amongst the youth and the generalized population, right? So again, yes, a very interesting World Bank breakdown of Namibia's unemployment. But also, I thought that the third thing that you raised around this improved governance is definitely something that I was noting when I was leaving Parliament, and which has definitely been a focus in South Africa around the government of national unity. This idea that this government seems to be performing better and being able to deliver outcomes that can be assessed by the citizens as going, oh, tick, Home Affairs is working better. Oh, tick, this is we're getting rid of corrupt officials. Yeah, that very visible kind of layer of accountability that's been applied within South Africa seems to be working very, very well. So I think those three themes that you raised, I think they can be kind of taken beyond just Namibia's experience, but more broadly. We're coming into the final part of the conversation before we head out for questions. So please, anyone who is on the conversation, we have only scratched the surface of what our very sophisticated and knowledgeable panel knows. So if there's something we haven't covered yet and you really want to know it, our panelists will be happy to address it. But I wanted to go back to both Chris and Taylor. In terms of final thoughts, if you have to leave behind for business on the political climate and environment, what would it be? I know, Chris, for example, you had quite a strong focus on reforming the conversations that we'd had before this, and we haven't really been able to touch on that particularly deep in this format. Maybe there's something more to say around there, but I'm interested to understand, just from the East African perspective, what is the major leave behind from the selection cycle for businesses that is positive, or is it an upward picture, downward picture, same? What can we take from it if we're kind of members of the ASBN and kind of looking into East Africa for business?
Sure. So I think from an East African perspective, the East Africa region looks quite positive, purely from a business perspective, from an investment perspective. In Tanzania specifically, I think the business climate is fairly stable, and I think that is partly attributed to the fact that I think in over 60 years of independence, we've only been under a single political party. So what we have essentially seen is that from 1992, when we had the multi-party elections, this is first multi-party elections, what we've essentially had is purely a change of presidents, but the political party has remained the same. This is partly due to sort of a very entrenched party system that we have in Tanzania. And also, I think it's partly also contributed to the political culture in Tanzania, where most citizens are essentially not driven to question the government and demand change, in the sense that, we have not seen a lot of the youth, for example, actually question had, and that really has made the process for transformation very slow. But on the other side, this is on the positive side, we have seen a continuous sort of stable business climate, and what we've also seen, and what we expect to see, I think, following the general elections in 2025, is that the current president is likely to continue for another 5-year term, and we have not seen also any sort of major concerns from an investment perspective. The president has really tried to open up the economic space, really tried to promote on sort of the economic diplomacy, which I think we suffered significantly after the 2019-2021 general elections. So all said and done, I think Tanzania looks very positive from an investment perspective, particularly the natural resources sector, the mining, the oil and gas space, the hospitality space, the infrastructure space, all are really booming in Tanzania. The political space will not change, I think, in the foreseeable future quite significantly. I think we have potentially a long way to go to see real and substantive reforms.
Thank you, Charles. Talia?
Perfect. I think, yeah, a general takeaway for businesses is that you know, change in regime is becoming more and more of a likely scenario. And the trends that we've highlighted, I think Angeline's spoken about it, I've spoken about it, Gordon's mentioned it, you know, rising youth populations, you know, high levels of education, and just generally more of a impatience amongst, you know, younger populations with governments. Those trends businesses really do need to pay attention to, because you know, as we've seen this year, it's had impact, and you know, we're always looking forward, and I'm looking at Kenya, Nigeria, big economies where there's a lot of business interest, and where you may be looking at one-term presidents because of those trends. And if business can, you know, just always keep that in the back of their mind, then it may not be as much of a shock when something does happen. Or, you know, you can just be prepared for, you know, looking at what is, you know, the potential new president campaigning on, what is their policy approach. So, you know, it's just always, you know, politics matters at the end of the day, and especially in Africa. So just staying on top of those trends, like I say, as change in regime just becomes more and more of a likely scenario.
So Talia, can I take from you, and forgive me for twisting your words, but business needs to wake up and realize that the status quo around African elections is possibly over. The time to engage is now, because there's going to be quite a lot of policy and regulatory change as a youthful population becomes increasingly unhappy with slow-moving government, and so that's going to put pressure on sort of all parts of society, including business. And some of that unhappiness might spread to businesses who are not seen to be actively engaging or kind of dealing with processes around policy and government. Is that a fair takeaway?
100%. And to add to that, I think something that is also very key is governments are going to start getting younger. As I say, you know, in Senegal, the new president is 44. He's the youngest elected leader in the continent. And, you know, we keep saying you've got this rising youth population who are educated, and those are your future politicians. And, you know, that's also just something that business needs to be aware of, is that your demographics in governments are going to start changing as well. I think we've just seen in Botswana as well. Their cabinet looks, there we go. Botswana has appointed a 26-year-old minister of youth. So that's also just always something to kind of
and I think a key differentiator between sort of African youth and sort of Western youth is that Western youth are actually voting for older and older. Right there, we've seen in the UK, Nigel Farage is capturing quite a large percentage of the youth vote. We've seen that happening in the United States, and so in Europe, conversely, we see a lot of young people voting for boomers in the election, right, who are trying to simplify things. When in the African context, the youth are stepping up and going, we want younger politicians, and that will change perspectives and views quite dramatically. Angelique, 3 minutes to close out, and then we'll move to questions. Is there a final takeaway that you want to leave us with?
No, I think Talia just made a very important point there. We're moving to governments with a lot younger profiles. We have the same in Namibia. We have some very young ministers, and actually those are the guys with the innovative ideas and just a slight change of tack on how it's always been done, and it's creating some good energy. So I think, a younger government is probably also in Namibia the future. It's already starting to happen. Perhaps a changed government in 4 years, if well, maybe even now. Let's not say it won't happen. There's only a tenth of the votes been counted so far. But definitely, I think that the reality has changed. We have to be prepared for change. That means as business, we have to engage now, because who we have had a relationship for the last 20, 30 years is changing. And I think it's a good sign that we want anti-corruption measures, that we want transparency, that we want efficiency, that we want speed. It's a really good sign. It means, Africa is up for business. Let's get it right.
Thank you, Angelique. This is obviously Talking Up Africa. We're talking the election special. I have Claire coming back on the screen, which means it's forcefully time for questions from our audience or attendees. And also, panelists, if there's a question that you have between each other that we haven't addressed, please feel free to bring it forward as well. Claire, can I hand back to you to manage questions?
Sure, thanks so much, Gordon, and a massive thank you to Angelique, Charles and Talia for taking part in this episode of Talking Up Africa. Certainly a fascinating discussion and debate, and quite interestingly to hear about the influence of the youth. Gordon, you're so right to point out that there is a massive difference between how youth behave in your global northern countries. I mean, you can take it from me, I'm from Scotland, but living in South Africa, and how the youth are responding to politics and elections in Africa. So it was really, really interesting to hear, youth coming into the discussion. I would love to open up the floor for questions. That's why we're holding it on Google Meets, how youthful of us. So if there's any questions from the audience, or indeed, as Gordon said, between our speakers, the floor is yours.
Claire, if I may throw a question to the panelists, because I'm always interested in tech and AI, and to the panelists, AI development is happening. I've seen models of work being produced that are literally going to make anyone under 25 sort of irrelevant to the working world, right? They just don't have the skills versus what the AI can do. You're telling me we've got a youthful population in Africa. You're telling me about high unemployment in Africa. What does AI mean for the political systems in Africa? And are we, as professionals in Africa, even beginning to consider the implications of what this means for risk, political risk, and economic risk?
I'm not the youth. I can't talk about AI. So I think it's a very important point. We're obviously in business already looking at the effects of AI, and we're not on the page yet that AI is going to replace jobs all that quickly. We're on the page that you can't do your jobs if you don't know how to do AI, right? So I think we're more on that page saying it can make us faster, more efficient, do more in a shorter amount of time, and do more with just the fingertips at a lot more data very quickly. What it means for politics is an interesting question. I'll have to think about that a little bit, but I think it will have a similar effect on what it means for business. It just has to be incorporated, and otherwise it's going to leave us behind if we don't.
I think across countries, it's in African countries right now, it is a discussion, especially probably among the business community, but potentially among citizens, not as big of a discussion. At the end of the day, if we look at just internet connectivity across the continent, that's an area where in certain countries up to, I think it was Gabon just had a kind of constitutional referendum, and the military junta said, well, we circulated the new constitution on social media as our way of letting citizens read it. A third of their population doesn't have access to social media or the internet. So that's, so I think it's every African country is very unique, and it depends on where they are in, especially their tech space and advancements in that. On the flip side, in politics, just something we've seen is the misuse of AI. Specifically ahead of elections, a lot of misinformation, a lot of also out of in West Africa, among the countries that are run by military juntas. It's if you go on Twitter and you look at any of those countries, the misinformation that is being turned over is just crazy, and it's all AI generated. I watched an AI generated video of Kenya's president speaking fluent French. And I'll be honest and say that, if you didn't know, you could have watched that video and been like, oh, wow, Ruto speaks very French, but absolutely he doesn't. So just from our side, I think that's been a very interesting thing in that, obviously, as we say, there are obviously a lot more educated people, but there are still a lot of uneducated populations that are voting. And if they're consuming this AI misinformation, it can also, just also impact the process.
Charles, did you want to comment, or would you prefer to move on to a separate question, which I think has come in from the audience? I think, Charles, if you don't mind, there's a question from Belinda who is asking about the challenges of electoral integrity. How can African nations address the challenges of electoral integrity, such as vote buying, misinformation, logistical barriers? And I know that you were talking earlier about some of the challenges Tanzania has faced specifically around electoral integrity. Is this a broader issue in Africa? Are there things that we can do to be combating it as business?
Yeah, I think this is a real issue in most of the African countries, and I think what potentially needs to be done to address this particular issue is first and foremost just have very robust sort of legal frameworks that number one ensure full independence of, say, the electoral sort of representatives who are overseeing and managing the elections. I think we should also try to explore. I think this is something that was introduced in Namibia perhaps some time ago, just in terms of electronic sort of voting and real sort of transmission of the results. So, for example, in Tanzania, we have an issue where you effectively don't get the results from the specific poll station published. So what that particular poll station does is that they transmit the result to sort of a central sort of authority, which then collects all the results across and then publishes the results. So it's very difficult for you to then go ahead and tally what the specific sort of results in a poll station were vis-a-vis what has actually been transmitted to the sort of central authority. So I think you sort of need to look at the legal frameworks. It's important to digitalize the election process as much as possible, and really have some very independent electoral sort of I'll say institutions that do look for and ensure sort of smooth elections in these countries.
Thank you, Charles. I think that brings us to the end of our conversation today. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining and giving up their time to help us better understand the political environment. Angelique, Chris, and I keep wanting to say Taylor, but it's not. I'm going to just say Ms. Parker, if it's okay. I apologize for butchering your name.
No
Thank
worries.
you for being in touch with us there on political issues. Obviously, we've only just scratched the surface of the topic. Obviously, any member is welcome to send any follow-up or additional questions to after this to the forum. We'd be happy to address them as best as we can. And then, Claire, I'm handing over back to you, and thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Gordon. I do have a question for you, but I'll ask it offline, and it is on the South African Unity government. I'd love your political insights on that, but I'll keep that for off the record. Massive thank you to our esteemed panelists today. It's been great to have you, and thanks to everyone in the audience who took part live in Talking Up Africa, the African election episode. Please stay connected with us here at Africa Scotland Business Network. We are available directly as a human team. We have not turned ourselves into bots or AI mechanisms at all. We're a real human team here. We, of course, embrace technology to reach an international market and our global footprint. But stay connected with us at www.africascotland.network and have a great weekend. Thank you very much for joining.